much for coming through today. We're very honoured to have Arthur Linker up here. Well, it's actually Dr. Arthur Linker. Not used to calling Arthur doctor. Don't feel sick, so you don't need to fix me.
The risk doctor.
Risk doctor. But Arthur's got his PhD in risk management from Stellenbosch and also an MBA, so very highly qualified. I've known Arthur, or Arthur and I go back a very long way. And so I've been involved with the risk fraternity for a long time, now on the Risk Intelligence Committee as well at IRMSA, which is great. But thank you very much, Arthur, for coming from Cape Town to come and talk to us. And we're looking forward to your presentation on risk maturity. I think we know that we've got various levels of risk maturity in organizations as risk officers as well, and anyone involved in risk advisory or audits. It's a hell of a difficult job to try and create value upwards and also to embed risk management downwards throughout the organization. Risk management is often seen as a little bit of a grudge thing that people have to do, but when it's done properly, it adds huge amount of value, but we've got to actually demonstrate that value upwards and downwards. So I think, Arthur, we're looking forward to your presentation. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jono.
Good.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. How are you? Good. Good. Jono, thanks for the opportunity. As Jono mentioned, we've known each other a long time. I think you were still in the Randburg offices, early 2000s. It's great to see how far we've all come. BarnOwl as well. So Jono helped me quite a bit in the PhD, and also IRMSA. I'll talk a bit about IRMSA. But I really appreciate the chance to chat to you today about something that I'm very passionate about, which is risk maturity. That was the subject of my PhD. I created a risk maturity index that you can use to look at the practical implementation of risk management, as well as the values towards risk management. So I'm going to be wearing, 2.5 hats today. I'm at the University of Stellenbosch Business School as a researcher and lecturer on risk management. Curricula is my risk advisory, which I just founded a couple months ago. So very excited to be doing the entrepreneurial thing. And then, as Jono mentioned, I've joined the Risk Intelligence Committee at IRMSA, and we're going to have some working groups around risk maturity. So that's very exciting. I'll talk a bit about the hashtag impact, which you may have heard of, and specifically what IRMSA is doing about risk management. So my accent is New York, Berlin, and Paarl. So interesting combination. My family is German. I grew up a lot in the States, and I've been living in Paarl now for the last few years with 3 kids. So quite a transition. Just looking at what we'd like to talk to today. I'm going to use the Titanic as a case study. I think it's something that everybody's quite familiar with. I often have, there's so many examples of risk failure we can talk about. We can talk about Steinhoff or KPMG or Momentum. And I often find that, people can be a bit sensitive about that, especially if they're from KPMG and so forth. So Titanic, something everybody knows, quite safe. Obviously also a very big risk management failure. Some of you may have seen some of this before. It's often used as a case study, certainly for operational risk. But we're going to try to look at some of the softer cultural issues around that risk culture and kind of the overall maturity of what happened with the Titanic. Then the topic is really broad. So as you would know, if you look at an enterprise risk management framework like ISO, for example, you've got the mandate and commitment, the tone at the top, then the actual process, identification, assessment, mitigation, reporting, controls, KRIs. So, we're trying to eat a bit of an elephant today. So it's going to be a bit like maybe drinking from a fire hose, lots of information. I am just trying to give a general background about enterprise risk management. What is it? Look at the updates of COSO and ISO, which have been recently updated, and then try to look at what are some of the critical success factors of these frameworks and use some examples of specific things there, like scenario planning, for example, something very important to companies. So that's the idea. Focus in on some of the critical success factors of risk maturity. Then I'll talk a little bit about the IRMSA hashtag impact initiative and what IRMSA is doing with risk maturity, and then concluding today. So I thought to set the tone, we'll just watch a little clip. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie. I looked at it the last few days. I'm surprised at how young Kate and Leonardo are. I guess they were in their 19 and 20, I think they were when it was filmed. So a long time ago. Just a scene to set the tone. If you pay attention at the end of the clip, it's about 2 minutes. You'll see a bit of a foreshadowing of the risk and what's going to happen. It's something I just picked up watching it again. And then throughout the Titanic discussion, think about the phrase, safety outweighing every other consideration. That's a really critical point when we look at this.
Hello, Jack. I changed my mind. They said you might be up here.
Give me your hand. Now close your eyes. Go on. Step up. Now hold on to the railing. Keep your eyes closed. Don't peek.
I'm not.
Step up onto the railing. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes closed. Do you trust me?
I trust you.
All right. Open your eyes.
I'm flying. Jack.
Come, Josephine, my flying machine going up. She goes, up she goes.
Okay, so there's the foreshadowing. I think one of the lessons there, I mean, you know, they're having one of the moments of their lives, and just very shortly thereafter, we know what happens. Lots of lessons there. I mean, we'll go into some of the details, but you know, she was a first-class passenger. He was a third-class, so a lot of the first-class passengers survived. Almost none of the third-class did. So lots of interesting issues there. I think the Titanic is a good example. Christelle used it as well. I don't know if any of you were in her governance session here, where she looked at the different layers in the Titanic. You know, the captain of the ship, the shareholders, the crew, and so forth. So you see the different layers, which play a very important role in risk maturity. And really, the captain of the ship is kind of like the CEO. I mean, it's the most basic analogy of that. And you know, if you think that, you know, that's how it works. So do you recognize this ship?
Yes.
Caught you, Jana. That's the White Stars Olympic.
No, I don't know that.
It's the sister of the Titanic. So there's a risk maturity lesson, which is don't jump to conclusions about risks. But it's actually a really interesting point. But we'll talk about bias a bit. So as human beings, we're overconfident. So this is just a little joke around the overconfidence, but we do it all the time. And certainly the Titanic itself was an example of that. So we've got the Olympic on the top, the Titanic. So they were sister ships. The Olympic came first. You can see here's another, if we look in a corporate sense, does anybody notice any difference between these two? There's one kind of main difference besides the chimneys. You can maybe see here, so they added an extra layer of cabins. So if we think in today's context, we want profitability, we want more return on investment. So we can see that something that they've decided to do there is to increase the capacity of the ship, which certainly also played a role later on with the disaster, there being too many people on board for what it was actually geared for. So White Star, developed by J.P. Morgan. You see some of the people with lots of money, they continue to stick around. So sometimes money makes more money. So back then, in the industrial era, that's when J.P. Morgan really started. And I think these are the main points here. So they were designed to compete with a German shipping line and with Cunard, which was another English shipping line, doing that transatlantic journey. So they usually started in Germany, let's say Hamburg, then they went to the UK, and then they went across to the States. So they really had, some main themes were affluence, luxury, but this was probably the most important point, which was the blue riband. And that went to the fastest crossing of the Atlantic. So that was like a record in terms of making it across. And that was actually held by Cunard through this whole period. So the Titanic, obviously on her first voyage, didn't break the record as they may have anticipated it to. So I think just setting the context there, the Olympic had lots of crashes, issues kind of as a ship. All of this is coming from a book called The Riddle of the Titanic, which is a really interesting read as a risk manager. I mean, there's so many things in there which are fascinating about people and processes and what went wrong. So the Olympic wasn't a terribly good ship. She was captained by Edward J. Smith. And I'm sure you can anticipate what's happening now. Edward J. Smith, quite a risky captain. He ran the Republic aground, ran the Coptic aground, ran the Adriatic aground. So, and also issues with his officers, so quite an autonomous character. And guess what? He was the captain of the Titanic on the maiden voyage. Yeah. So you look at it in hindsight, I mean, this is one of the things about risk, black swans, we see them afterwards, we think, oh, that was so obvious. But, there's so many cases of it, is it a Steinhoff CEO, or is it Volkswagen with a diesel scandal? We see a lot of this, and I think this is one of the big lessons around risk maturity. The tone is set at the top, and it cascades through the organization. And I think, a lot of us working with risk on a day-to-day basis, we might be like Kate and Leonardo, everything's going good here, but, in the big picture, things aren't being run properly. So these are kind of just facts. So if we look at risk maturity, this is, let's say, risk identification, risk assessment, mitigation. This is live as it happened. So they had warnings, all the other ships in the ice field were at a dead stop. Those warnings were communicated. There were no binoculars in the crow's nest. So can you imagine the ship is going out and there's no binoculars? So I just read the other day that was because the guy who was in charge of that kind of room where the binoculars were, he didn't make the ship, and then no one had the key. So they just thought, oh, so we won't use the binoculars today. I mean, it's unbelievable if you think about some of these failures. And then the super high speed, obviously. And then this is that point, linking back to that record. So the MD of White Star was actually on the boat because he was anticipating to get to New York, lots of press, and that they would have broken the speed record. The safety response capability is really the biggest gap. Very, very challenging. So, I mean, some of these, I don't know if any of you are aware of some of these facts and figures, but, this is, to me, this is just something which I still just can't come to terms with, which is that the maximum, if all the lifeboats had worked perfectly, 1,600 people, but there was over 2,200 passengers on board. So you just think, but this is that message that, it's indestructible, we're not going to need them anyway. There's a lot of scenario planning and readiness. We talk about risk resilience. So one thing I also recently read was that they, before every Sunday, they used to do a test of the lifeboats. And the Sunday before this happened, she was already at sea, and they didn't do the lifeboat test. So that's just another thing that it was apparently absolute chaos at the lifeboats. Who gets in, first class, women, children, but nobody knew. So really quite a disastrous factor. So this is the book, and then that was the catchphrase, and this is what, one of the key messages is to me. So this was the frame notice in the chart room of every White Star liner. Safety outweighing every other consideration. So that's, we see that in the modern day if we have a company that talks about sustainability or things like that and they're not really living that. That's one of the biggest messages. And the thing is, it cascades through the organization. I mean, ultimately, everybody that worked for the ship knew that the actual goal was to do the fastest Atlantic crossing. I mean, if I'm a coal shoveler firing the steam turbines, I know that we're not going safe, and they would have heard that there's icebergs. People communicated up and down the ship, and they must have been thinking shoveling in coal for maximum speed. So they know what's going on, and the organization knows, and it's often done through KPIs these days, where what you're being measured on is what is actually the objective, and there's often quite a disconnect there. Good. I wanted to make it interactive. I mean, if there's any questions as I go, otherwise I'll try to leave a bit of time at the end. And as I said, we're going to go through a lot of material. Jono's going to post the slides on the site, and just feel free to ask me at any time if I'm going through some of the issues too quickly. As I said, the ERM is a huge topic, and we all have different levels that we're working with it on. So I'm just trying to do almost a shotgun approach and then focus in on the issues that are key. So a little bit about my perspective of risk. So I don't come from audit, so I don't wear a trench coat and have a checklist and I see if the fire extinguisher is there. No, I'm just doing a cliche. It's very important. I mean, we saw with the Titanic that factor is also very important. But I'm coming from a strategic perspective of risk, from the sales management side. Seeing the opportunities. And we've seen, we'll get into COSO and ISO a bit, but we've seen the language of the ERM frameworks change a lot. And there's a lot more focus now on strategy and strategic objectives and creating value and opportunity. So I really believe that. I've seen it work. Some of the consulting that I've done, if we can convince parts of the organization to make some changes, to use KRIs, and they're convinced of those advantages, they can beat the competition, launch a product faster, all of these good things that come out of risk. So ERM, hopefully you're all very familiar with this. Systematic process, enterprise risk management, language around events, upside, downside, opportunities, hazards. I'm just going to go really quickly through this. ERM is linked to a lot of different aspects, governance and compliance, certainly. Sustainability is a natural field for risk. If you look at the social factors, the environmental factors, business models, very much impacted by risk. Nice thing is it's applicable to any industry, any country, any organization. So a framework like ISO, you customize to make it work for that organization. We've done a lot of work with the public sector, with SMEs even. SMEs are more susceptible to risk. They might not have big bank balances or loan accounts. So, doing enterprise risk management is important for any type of organization. So one thing that we found helped a lot with the communication, if you take a risk-based view of the strategy, what will help or hinder us in achieving the strategy? I mean, often, we're all in risk management, but let's say you go to someone in human resources. I consulted to one of the large retailers. In our first workshop with human resources said, we're human resources, we don't have any risks. So, we know that people is one of the main factors. So if we've got to execute a strategy, we need the right people, we need to pay them properly, we need to train them, we need to keep them, so there's a whole lot of risks there. So, it helped in that context to say, how can human resources support this retailer in achieving the objectives, all the things we can do with people. The umbrella view is important. We'll talk about, you're only as good in risk maturity as your weakest link. So, there might be pockets of excellence in the business. Let's say maybe you're a mine and you're very good operational, health and safety, you've got all that, but, maybe there's another aspect that's missing. So that umbrella portfolio is very important. Top-down, bottom-up engagement is critical. The organizations that do very well, the tone at the top sets a strategic objective, and everybody's working on that and everybody's aligned. So, only the people in the field know the risks. So in the Titanic example, the guys working on the boilers, they know what's happening. Are they overheating? So you need to rely on that. So it's a real top-down approach in the organization. And stakeholders are also coming up quite a bit, and that's very important. So one of your stakeholders might be the bank. So if you convince the bank that you're doing good enterprise risk management, you've got good maturity, maybe they'll give you a few points on your credit line, or they'll give you a bigger loan or things like that. So it's just one example. Obviously, the ratings agencies like Moody's, S&P, they all use enterprise risk management as an assessment either of government, public sector, or firms. For example, MTN just had a downgrade from one of the rating agencies because of a lot of these issues that they've been having, the fine and issues in various countries. So stakeholders very important. It's not just about us, but who are we interacting with, who are our clients, who are our suppliers, and so forth. So risk management's been around a long time. I almost forgot about this, but the predecessor to ISO 31000 was this Australia-New Zealand standard in '95. So that's been almost 25 years, and that's really been going for a long time. And fundamentally, a lot of these processes haven't changed too much. But now we're just getting more strategic, and the language is becoming more in terms of value creation for risk, not just controlling. So this is just the basic kind of setup. It's a plan, do, review process, like a lot of management systems. We start with contextualizing the organization internally. Let's say, what are our strengths and weaknesses, external opportunities and threats. Then we identify risk, we assess it, we respond. But here we're already seeing that there's a lot of areas where risk maturity plays a role. How do we identify risk? Do we sit in a boardroom and we have a chat about it? Do we do a Monte Carlo analysis? Do we do a scenario planning? So the devil's in the details as to how we do these things. And that's what risk maturity is really about, is doing these things in the best possible way for the organization. This is the old ISO 31000 from 2009. Really, quite basic, good to understand. It all starts with a mandate and commitment at the top. That's the captain of the ship, the board, the executive. Then, we decide what framework we're going to implement in our organization. And it's different. If I'm a retailer, it's different than if I'm a bank, than if I'm a manufacturer. What country am I in? How big is my organization? So we adapt the framework to our organization. Then we implement it, which has the process. We monitor and review, and we do continual improvement because it's ISO. So this is the process. Also, nothing too new, the whole assessment process. And then I just picked this out. This was interesting. This is a slide I've been using for a very long time. It's from 2007, so also over 10 years ago. And it was just showing a lot of the other factors. ISO is a process, that's very clear. But like anything in an organization, the culture, the change management, all of these things play a huge role. So very busy slide, but it really does capture a lot of what's needed. And a lot of you in risk management, you might agree that change management is a huge aspect. How do you get people to look at the risk register, to talk about these risks, to identify new things? So there's a process in the organization. And then if you look specifically, you can see that this strategy, in a sense, is already mentioned even way back then. Performance measurement is there if you're using KPIs and KRIs. So these are all aspects of optimizing this framework and having a high level of risk maturity. So this is the new ISO. I don't know if you've seen it. It's about a year old. It's the more accessible document. It's still only about 20 pages. If you go online and Google, you'll find it on some Russian server somewhere. You can have a look at it. Unlike COSO, which nobody's been able to find on the internet. So pretty much basically the same. There's a bit more talk about value creation and protection. These are some of the key issues and some of the things that we're doing there. The human and cultural factors are really starting to come out of the process. So interestingly enough, I always preferred ISO 31000. think the new COSO is very good, if you have a chance to have a look at that. It's massive. I mean, I think the file is like 50 meg. I mean, it's hundreds of pages, the COSO, but the COSO is really starting to give you ideas of how to better performance manage the organization. These are the ISO principles and process. So this is where the risk maturity comes into play primarily. Cultural factors, improvement, these are the values and the principles, and then the process. How do we technically do risk management? So this, again, you can get the slides. I just picked this one. It's COSO on a page, the old COSO. So the old COSO was a lot around the control environment, control activities, assessing controls and so forth. So you would remember the COSO cube. So all of this is still meant to be implemented from a process side, but now COSO has moved to this COSO spiral. So if you haven't seen that and you're in risk management, it's really important to have a look at that. So this is all about driving value. So we start with the objectives of the organization, and then everything we do as an organization is to achieve those and to increase the value. So all of these, are sessions in and of themselves. Governance, objective setting, performance review, the communication. There's a really good executive summary of this, which you can get for free online. So if you just Google COSO executive summary, it's called Enterprise Risk Management Executive Summary. And then you'll see a lot of this information there, and it gives you an idea. Obviously, in the main document, they unpack each of these aspects in a lot of detail, surprisingly a lot of detail. They use cases of companies that we would know and what they're doing in these aspects and things like that. So it's quite a good document. I think this one sums it up. And if we look at it from a risk maturity perspective, if we're creating a risk maturity framework, which we'll get into, a model that we want to use to assess our risk maturity, these will be a lot of the factors that you've got to have a look at that are very, very critical in terms of risk maturity. And I'm just coming back to the performance management. Depending on what function you have in the organization, this is critical. Your KPIs, we chatted about it last night. I mean, your KPIs are what your organization's measuring. That's what you got to do. If you're in sales, you've got to sell what they want you to sell, and then you'll get a bonus. If you're in human resources and you need to retain talent, they'll measure you on how many staff leave. So, if you link that with the risk system, it's really, really powerful. And again, the message is that each function in the communication needs to think about how can my function, human resources, marketing, logistics, how can I help the organization achieve the objectives? And if you can make that mind shift, it often gives a lot of value to risk. It moves it away from, Jono, you often say the tick box exercise, the governance side, which is important. You've got to do that. But if you can convince the organization to see the value, that's a really big difference. Good. Here's some notes just on the updates. I think this is the most important one that I highlighted, is in terms of creating and protecting value. That's really the idea. We've always known about the protect value part, but the idea is really to get into the create value side. And everything is becoming more digital, Industry 4.0. I mean, every industry is changing, whether it's the legal profession, whether it's the medical profession, whether it's accounting, whether it's law. I mean, in the law space, they used to have, the students doing their articles. They would spend days searching for documents, finding the right case for this particular thing. Now they just have a search engine. They put in the things around the case that they're interested in. A few seconds later, they get cases. So industries are transforming. And if you can highlight the risks to your industry, to your business, to your organization, if you can highlight those risks, then you can find ways to mitigate that and actually maybe even get a competitive advantage. If you do it quicker than the competition, if you do it better, does that make sense? Good. All right. Culture and biases. So I just wanted to do one little example there. Jono helped us with identifying the Olympic. So I'm just going to do an exercise quickly. It's called calibration. So if we think about from a risk maturity perspective, we know about risk identification, assessment, mitigation. So there's been lots of studies done around human beings. So we're overconfident. There's other things about us we are very worried about losing. So especially in the risk space, it's been proven we multiple times more worried about losing $1,000 than winning $1,000. So if people do tests with actual $1,000, we can see that behavior. They protect. They don't want to lose 1,000. That's the main objective. So a lot of this identification and assessment is around calibration. So we don't want to make mistakes. We don't want to thumbsuck and say, this is a 5 out of 7 on the impact scale. That can be quite dangerous. So I'm going to give you an example. It's about a train and how fast a train goes. I know you all got your phones, you could Google, but I'm going to ask you about the speed of a train, and I just want you to think about it, and then give me that figure. But don't Google, just play along and just see. So basically in 1938, British steam locomotives set a new speed record by going how fast? You can say in miles per hour, kilometers per hour, just have a think. 40. 40 miles per hour. Okay, that's like 80, maybe 80K, 70. Okay, so everybody's got that number. So have that number in your head. And then what they do with these experiments is they calibrate your reliability. So it's very important. If I'm an engineer and I'm working on Coburg nuclear reactor, I know that number and I've got to be 100% sure about it. I can't take a guess and be like 50% sure. So this calibration thing is important. And this is what they do in the academic tests. They either shock people or they give or take money from them. So you're hooked up to a device, and if you get the wrong answer, you get a shock. Or they give you 1,000 Rand to take part, and every one you get wrong, they take 50 Rand from you. So in this exercise, you've got that speed in your mind. If you had to be 90% sure about that speed, how would you do the range of it? So let's say you said it was 50. You're sure it's at least 20, maybe it's 80. And you're 90% sure. Does that make sense? Okay, so you said 40. I'm just going to pick on you. 40 miles is 80 kilometers per hour. How would you need to extend that range to be 90% sure?
Extend the range. I would say between 40 and 50. I don't think steam can go much faster than that.
Okay.
The steam.
Yeah. You're leaning out the window on this one. It's another trick. Anyone else? Jana, what do you think? Put you on the spot.
So I think probably 80 kilometers an hour, and the range would be between 70 and 100.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Anyone think slower? I mean, it's a long time ago, 38. Now I'm priming you. Anyone think faster? Okay, the drum roll, and again, this is a classic example we use in the risk management space. That's the mallard. She looks fast. She went 203 kilometers an hour and still holds the record. And did quite well. She did 2.4 million kilometers. She did lots of tours, and people wanted to see her. So look, it's a banal exercise. But the idea is to get you to think. You'd be surprised at how often this happens. So, obviously, if you're working at Coburg, they've got a program around that. It's very technical. It's engineering. They're working with very mathematical. But as you drift into the qualitative, people are often way out in the calibrations. So a good maturity measure of organizations is, are they calibrating the people that are making some of these decisions? If we're talking 1 billion Rand or 100 billion Rand, things like that, people can often be out.
Was that the loco on its own, or was it the joint?
I think it's just the loco. But it also, if you think, these days we're driving at 120K on the motorway, you think, Anyway, it was a bit of a setup, this one. But, there's a good book by Hubbard. Hubbard is really the decision science guy who's done a lot of the research on this, and they've got hundreds of questions like this. It's almost less important that you know the factoid or not, but how sure you are and how you work through the process. So one thing you might mitigate is maybe you have a friend. So I used to work at Oricon consulting engineers. I'd call one of the rail engineers and say, oh, how does that work? So we start to bring that amount down and make it more accurate. Good. The risk frontier just a couple of things on that. So, risk started with insurance many, many years ago. So there's an example that was documented of Chinese riverboat captains. We seem to be using boats a lot as a theme because they sink. But so these riverboat captains got together. They made a pool. It's almost like a Stockfell kind of arrangement where, if one of the boats went down, the guys could borrow from the others and then get back up and then pay it back in. So that was documented a very long time ago. And then Lloyd's, when all the sailing around the world happened, and insurance is very calculable, especially something like auto insurance. There's been this many incidents. This is a 20-year-old male driving a GTI. You can see where the stats are going. So it's very, very quantifiable. Financial risk has also been around a long time. I mean, the stock markets are also hundreds of years old. There was a tulip speculation thing a couple hundred years ago. I don't know if you heard of that. And if we see Bitcoin today, I mean, it's almost the same movie exactly again. People were paying, in today's equivalent, about R1 million for one tulip. The flower, for one bulb, they were paying that much money. And they were just circulating them around, and then when the music stopped, someone got stuck. So, we're seeing that all the time. Also quite quantifiable, lots of models going into the operating environment, into the organization, and then really, the key issues, if you'd look at the IRMSA risk report, if you look at the World Economic Forum report, we're seeing a lot of these really strategic issues, brand, reputation, it's always there. I mentioned technology, digital transformation. If you look at the companies that are in the Fortune 500, it's changing all the time. I mean, Amazon, Facebook, Google, they weren't around too many years ago. So lots and lots of things happening. And then while this is happening, you may have heard of the phrase VUCA. It's also just something I wanted to expose you to if you hadn't heard it. It's quite a catchphrase these days. With management, it was a Harvard business thing. But basically that the world is becoming more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And there's a lot of examples of that. So if we look at social media as an example, depending on your type of business, that can be something that's really thrown you for a loop. We look at the Momentum case. The Momentum CEO, you heard about that, where Momentum didn't want to pay out the claim. The guy was killed in the hijacking. So, maybe Momentum is right. I mean, that's a contract. A lot of people will argue that. But just the way the CEO came out and kind of gave that impression, people didn't like it. Social media got a hold, and, suddenly you're losing lots of clients based on a 1-minute interview with your CEO. So that's an example of how things are changing, how the world is changing. So you need to have a high risk maturity. You need to be risk resilient. And one of the ways you do that is you have business continuity management. You have a way of dealing with the media, and regardless of what happens, you address the media through one channel, and you work on that and you practice it and these kinds of things. That's one of the ways to become more resilient. All right, on to risk management maturity, kind of the crux of the conversation. Ernst & Young says companies in the top 20% of risk maturity generate 3 times the EBITDA, earnings before tax, depreciation, amortization, as those in the bottom 20%. Ernst & Young would say that. Of course, they're selling risk advisory services. But yeah, it's been proven on the academic side. We've got research linking ERM with firm performance. We can see the market cap of companies and things like that. So there's a relationship between companies doing good risk management and companies that are doing well. It doesn't mean the one is because of the other. Maybe they have a lot of money and that's why they're investing in risk management, but the two are definitely correlated. So just a few words in terms of maturity culture is the one I wanted to focus on first. All of the frameworks and documents mention culture. So whether it's King 4 or RIMS or COSA, ISO, everybody's talking about risk culture. So it's very, very, very critical. The tone at the top is really the thing that distinguishes that. And then probably the second biggest thing is accountability. And how does your firm measure or your organization measure accountability? If you work at PwC and you say, I'm going to have that report Friday at noon, and all the partners are waiting for it. If it doesn't come Friday at noon, you do that once and then you're out. And that's really how it is. So if your firm or your organization already has that kind of, oh, I'll give it to you on Friday, but then it's next week, that's just an example of accountability. So it's not just a risk thing, but a culture with high accountability where I care what my colleagues think and we all working together. That's a very strong risk maturity success factor. There's a lot of information on culture if you're interested. IRM, the UK Institute for Risk Management, they did this study in 2013. I was one of the contributors to this, to the culture. It's a whole kind of culture issue that they did, a white paper, so you can get a hold of that. But it's basically saying that culture is quite complex. It's like an onion. I mean, we have our personal preferences. Am I someone that wants to gamble $1,000 or not? That's almost genetic. That's inside me. And then we've got layers of, let's say our family, how we grew up in the environment, the company, who our friends are, and then ultimately that shapes the culture that's actually being lived in an organization. Some of the key considerations, a lot of it is around not persecuting people, letting people express. So whistleblowing is an example. Do people feel that they have the right to speak out? Diversity is very important. We know about the lack of diversity in South African boardrooms, for example. If we're all 60-year-old white males looking at the same problem, we're all going to have a very similar perspective. So the diversity is important to see the different things. And then ethical principles is really the key. So we've seen a lot of the failures, Volkswagen with the diesel scandal. More and more is coming out now in terms of Steinhoff. That's really seems to be just accounting fraud, at its most basic. So, very clear ethical guidelines that were broken. And then just one thing I wanted to leave you with as risk managers. I'm going to talk a little bit about the IRMSA hashtag impact. But, we as risk managers, we also have to contribute. And a lot of the kind of skills and the attributes that we have also play a role there. I mean, you're all in risk management. You know that we've got to be strong technically with the numbers. We've got to be good with relationships. We've got to get people to listen to us. We've got to be organized. So, a lot of these skills and competencies are very important there. So, if you look at the risk management team, that's also a very clear indicator of the risk maturity. What type of people are they? Are they respected in the organization? And so forth. This is just a quick Dilbert. So the boss says we need a risk analysis of this project before I can approve it. And he's busy working indecisiveness, over-analysis, cluelessness, micromanagement. And the boss says, I don't understand these risks. And he says, that's number 36. So we've all seen that movie. So I think there's a few messages here. There's the silo, there's the tone at the top. But I'm not going to go too much into the identification, quantification, and mitigation. There's a compendium to ISO 31000, 31010. It has 101 risk assessment methodologies. Do we do a fishbone? Do we do a bow tie? Do we do Monte Carlo? Do we do, there's 101 ways to do it. The message is, depending on your business and what's important, you need to find the right ways to identify, quantify, and mitigate risk. So, that goes without saying. And scenario planning is one of the best ways to do that. So I've consulted to a bank, to a telecoms company. They're both doing a lot of work around the scenario planning. And it's a big investment. If we're going to get 10 people in a room for half a day, it's going to cost us a lot of money. They've got to turn their phones off, and we need them to focus. So it's very, very hard to do these days. But this really is one of the top ways of looking at the risks, thinking about the unexpected. You get a lot of smart people in the room that know the organization, and they'll come up with some of these things. And business resilience is also in the risk maturity model, so it's in the RIMS model, and it's in my local model as well. Business continuity management, that's how that's implemented. All right, then I just wanted to talk about risk management information systems. So Jono explicitly said it's not a BarnOwl pitch today. But, this is just really, really well illustrated. So if you imagine the white is ISO 31000, or, it's a risk management framework, the green is all the things that the software, in this case BarnOwl, does. So the risk management information system supports good risk maturity. So I've used this module of BarnOwl 100 times in terms of getting executives in a room or a team in a room, looking at the strategic objectives. You've probably all done it with the clickers. It's very powerful. You have this discussion, you put a risk up, you vote anonymously, then people have a look at it. So it's all about the strategy, and you can capture those objectives. And the important thing is you can link everything to these objectives. So if we've got a sustainability objective or a BE objective or whatever it might be, we can link this whole system back there. So that's really powerful. We can capture the risks, the key risk indicators. We can use the voting. If we want to do a culture check, we get a nice culture survey. We can send that out through the software and link it with the risks and so forth. So I think this is really important. And maximizing all these things, using these tools, using the controls, it's quite critical. Good. All right, the last section, risk maturity. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I see our time is going. But it was the crux of what we wanted to talk about. So there's a number of risk maturity models out there, risk management maturity models. One of the most famous is this one from RIMS. I'm an associate of RIMS. That's the US Risk and Insurance Management Society. Two of my clients have used this one. So this is a very top-down tool, and it's quite complex. So they have 7 attributes which are important, and then they've got competency drivers within those, and then key readiness indicators. So the one client is a bank. They probably spend 100 hours with their executive using this, just to get an idea of how involved it is. So they literally took this team through all of these issues. And look, the people know the company, they know the organization, so they're not gonna lie about things or make things up. So, it does give you a pretty good view. One of the challenges with this is it doesn't kind of ask the people on the ground in the field. And you can have huge differences in an organization. So in the bank, for example, the retail team is very different from the asset team is very different. You can imagine the different teams in the bank have different kind of risk approaches. So the instrument I'll show you that I'm using, that I've developed, kind of goes into the teams, and you can see the differences. So this is the RIMS one. IRMSA's still busy with an assessment of South Africa using this model. So that went out at the end of last year. These are basically the key issues that they think are critical for risk maturity. Then they go into some detail there. And then each of them has competency drivers. So you're basically rating each of these. There's questions on each of these, and you rate them from a 1 to 10. And then in theory, you can roll this whole pyramid up. So they've identified, through getting people together, these are the important risk things, the risk culture, the accountability, how you report. All of these things come from that framework, and then it's just asking the right questions, all throughout this thing. So these are the 7. This is an example of one of the questions. This was the survey that went out a couple months ago. This is how it works. So this gets sent to the executive of the organization. They answer these questions, and then the feedback comes back. You can see here, you can then map everything out. It gets quite sophisticated. So for each of these, you've got this scale of 1 to 10. You've got kind of the fully mature, where we want to be and where we are. And then you can map actions to each of these. So you can access this. This is available, this model. It's a lot of work to get to know it, to understand it, to implement it. And your organization has to have the appetite to do this. This isn't a one day's exercise and our risk maturity is 3.8 or something. It's very involved. This is just a depiction of how it cascades. So each of these are individual kind of components that go into themes that go into the main issues. Does that make sense? Okay, so there's other models like this. This is the VMIA one. It's a little bit different from the RIMS one. This one comes from Australia, so we're not going to use it. No, I'm just kidding. It's often, you make a hybrid of these of what works for your organization. And then I mentioned in my PhD, I created a scale, which is now 26 items. Working with the bank, we've overlaid that with RIMS. So the bank had this challenge that they had a high-level view, and the bank is really keen, like any little maturity additions and fixes and they can do. I mean, banks and financial services institutions are very risk mature. And any little advantage they can get with culture or how they assess. So we overlaid the two instruments. This one went into the bank, into the divisions, and it got the kind of view of junior, middle, and senior management. And then we mapped that to what the executives had said in the RIMS one. And a lot of things came up very similar. For example, action plans. This bank in particular is not good with action plans, and they know that. They can't give someone an action plan and then follow up 3 months later. That's not in their culture. So they've identified that, and they know that they need to get people to work at things through an action plan methodology. This one is also very important, the whistleblowing. We know the challenges with that here in South Africa. Everybody says, just blow the whistle, and then, they go after your kids or whatever. So it's a very sensitive one, but in risk maturity, that's very important, that people feel that they can speak out about the risks. This is some examples of how, on my model, how the outputs look. So, you can see how people scored on this item. All employees take responsibility for improving risk management. You see the scores, you see the deviation. High deviations are worrying. It means that some people agree with it and some people don't, so you need to have a look at that. At the bank, we saw different levels of management, saw some of these issues differently. So the junior managers might be very positive, and the senior managers are more worried about it. So these are the kind of fine-tuning things that you can do. You can put it on a spider and just see in clusters. So a lot of these items move in clusters. Good. Then if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask afterwards, or maybe we'll have a minute or two. IRMSA, I just wanted to touch on quickly. So are you all aware of IRMSA? Okay. I hope so. The first question. I did a thing at DEMISA the other day, which is the Disaster Management Institute, which is like our parallel organization, and they'd never heard of this thing. People came up to me afterwards from disaster, the fire chiefs and those kinds of people. And they said, we've been using the World Economic Forum. Is there a local one of these? It was quite an eye-opener. So, this is a really good report. This can be used. And then we've got this hashtag impact. And Pravin Gordhan spoke at the last IRMSA conference and really motivated. So this is where I'll be on the soapbox maybe for half a minute. But, you made a very valid point. We're professionals. We've got these designations. We're at the heart of the business. We see the risk. And a lot of the professional organizations, societies haven't done very well. If you look at accounting, KPMG, we know Deloitte was the auditor of Steinhoff, and you're telling us that Deloitte doesn't know that 7 billion, euros moved around the balance sheet. It's quite concerning. And basically what Pravin said is that, we're in a similar situation, that we know the organizations and, we can't blame it on public sector, but, private sector everybody's involved and we all need to do more. That's really the message. So I had a thought piece in there, and I mentioned that IRMSA is doing the RIMS assessment. We want to benchmark the South African risk maturity, and then we want to look at the South African industries, how they compare with their global peers, and then potentially help organizations through IRMSA with risk maturity and follow up, and that we all need to do our part. That's the key message. All right, so just summing up, wrapping up, top 10 risk maturity critical success factors. We've looked at a lot of these. The tone at the top, you just can't get away from that. Some people I know knew Marcus Jooste personally. He was really that guy that either was shouting at you, making you feel like you were worthless, or when he smiled at you, that was his personality. So very, very manipulative, running the organization in that way. So the tone at the top is very definitive. We remember the captain from the Titanic. We're going to go for the speed record. So that's one of the top things. Clearly defining and communicating the objectives. So don't put on your ship that safety is the number one concern when you actually want to break the speed record. Understanding the internal and external context, very, very important. Our organization has people, we have strengths and weaknesses. We really need to take an honest look at that. What opportunities are there in the market? Holistic, so not having silos because you're only as strong as the weakest link. calibration of experts, using BCM in scenario planning. It's just getting more and more important. We see it again now with the load shedding. A lot of organizations thought that that wasn't going to come back, and now they're wondering, scrambling again, what to do. So you always need to think about these things. KRIs and action plans, we didn't talk about those too much, but that's really a sign of a healthy organization. That's performance managing, to the objectives. Clear lines of accountability and escalation. Employees taking accountability for risk and continual improvement, and then the holistic view. And then just to wrap up, the Titanic. We saw a lot of these lessons there. The tone at the top, the misalignment between the stated objective and the actual objective. We looked at some of the technical risk issues there were, not identifying and mitigating properly. That's always there. And then not having the appropriate crisis plan in place. They said we're never going to sink. We're not unsinkable. But what if? Good. And then risk maturity to protect and create value and achieve our strategic objectives so that Leo and she can fly without any risk. Good. Thank you very much.
With all the frameworks that are there on risk, then how do you decide, let's say for a poor CRO, how then will they decide which one to use, or which one is advantageous for them to use?
So you're asking how to select the right risk maturity
with all these
framework.
frameworks that are there.
You can start with, the one that RIMS did with everyone here through IRMSA. I think that was about 30 questions. So that's quite a high level one. And that can start to give you an idea of some of the areas. If you've reported on that honestly, and where are the areas in the organization. So that might give you some direction. What areas you want to focus on. As I mentioned, to do the full RIMS one with all of those attributes, that's quite a challenge. Sometimes organizations will pick one of those categories. So if you go back here, doing something properly is better than not doing anything. So maybe we know we're poor at root cause discipline. Once we have if we're manufacturing and lots of things are going wrong. Or maybe, Tiger with the listeriosis, maybe, that was an actual failure, a technical failure of their risk identification. So maybe they say, we're going to do a risk cause discipline focus and do that as a starting point.
Okay, just a follow-up.
Sure.
When you are, as you are saying with the RIMS, what if you are in the public sector? Will it work the same, or there are maybe better frameworks that are well inclined with the public sector? Maybe other ones with the private sector.
This one you can Google, this Australian one. This is a public sector one that's been used in Australia. So the VMIA. I didn't put the category, you can see the main categories there, but they're also looking at blocks within this whole ERM framework. They're looking within certain blocks. So this could also be a starting point to have a look at. A lot of organizations are doing the risk culture one now, just because a lot of these issues are softer issues, and they're causing a lot of impact. Yes?
So, in your experience, does management really care? So, if you're looking now, there's updates in ISO 31000 and COSO. Does management really care, or is it just us, the risk professionals, that fuss about such things?
Yeah, no, it's a perfectly valid question. I've been teaching this on the MBA, for years now, and I probably 30-40% of students just don't get it and don't care. It's just one of those things. It's a difficult game we're in, and you remember I showed that slide of the attributes you need as a risk manager. It's a very tough job. You need to know the business. You need to be convincible. You need, So yeah, unfortunately. I think, I don't want to say too much, but I know that Steinhoff was looking at a software, for example, and engaging with them around the risk management software. One could get the feeling that, they weren't really interested in knowing some of these things, if that makes sense. And, it's also up to us as individuals, who do we want to work for? I guess I'm getting a bit philosophical now, but, it's something we have to ask ourselves. And that's what, Pravin Gordhan has said, is that we must ask ourselves, are we comfortable with that? That's a big part of what we do. I think good risk managers, they should have access to all the strategy and all the things that are happening and try to do the best for the company. But yeah, certainly some people aren't interested. Christelle.
Comment on that. I think and I'm a risk manager for 25 years, so I'm criticizing myself as well. But if management doesn't care, we're doing it wrong. And I think that is quite critical. If you think about, we believe so much in it, we think everybody should. But if it doesn't make business sense to that, then we're just a compliance. It comes to the question around standards and frameworks there.
Yeah, I think it was a follow-up on that, because how do you then convince them that we are now going with COSO or we're going with
But sometimes you can't.
Because it sort of doesn't matter to them.
I'll be very honest, sometimes you can't. And I mean, it's a decision I've had to make. Like with the bank, I'm so excited because the bank really cares. Like the bank really wants to tweak this, and we're doing like really new stuff, and it's very exciting. But I could go to 5 other clients, and they just, they just won't. They just won't do it. It's how it is.
It's all about value. It's all about value and how you display the value as a risk manager. So somehow, whether it's like if you're going to present to a CFO, you got to interlink the numbers to it, because he tends to understand that better.
Yeah.
To a CEO, it's using the strategy as a guideline.
Where the human resources, how the people
correct.
come into the
So
strategy.
It's basically up to us as risk managers to really convince the exec.
Yeah.
It's how we do it. So I agree with the lady earlier that said it's actually up to us.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, going back, it's quite a skill set. I mean, if you have a look at this, I mean, that's hectic. Yeah.
Well, it's very true that culture becomes key when you discuss risk. And each time I find myself in a workshop where we talk risk, culture will come up tops, because managerial competence is quite important in that. When you are being hired as a manager, there will be key things that you know that you are responsible for, over and above your field.
Yeah.
You've got finances to run, you've got human resources to manage, you've got all sorts of assets that you should manage. But now, even IT, your IT stuff, which you've got to work with, the software you might be using and so on. But now when it comes to issues of risk management, and I know I might be repeating myself in other instances, it all of a sudden becomes a terrain of the so-called risk management office. Now you lack management competency at an executive level in that regard. So now we're speaking risk maturity, and we're trying to elevate risk management culture. But we find that there are basic things which you are expecting to be done at an executive management level. You also highlight the issue of ethics, for example, and relationships within management. Yeah. And when you've got management that grapples with relating, when you've got management that grapples with the issue of ethics, now it's even difficult to get to a point of saying, let's discuss how we take risk maturity elsewhere. Because risk maturity would say, let's drill down to even hidden places we've never been to, without running a compliance checklist and so on. Asking ourselves difficult questions. That's what risk is supposed to do. But we are even far off from doing that, because we've got people who have been hired, yet are running quite short of even the basic things that they are supposed to be doing. Even before we get to the real debates, the real discussions around looming issues which might be problematic to the organization. So here we can be empowered intellectually and otherwise, even in terms of networks and connections. But when we get back, there are decision makers whom we're supposed to convince, and maybe convince is not the right word. I hear one of my colleagues saying we might not be doing it right. Maybe we should get the way of doing it right then. You talk to, which is my last thing offering, I know I might talk the whole day. We talk to
Till lunch, is lunch time?
We talk to KRIs, KPIs, action plans, and so on and so forth. Usually the KRIs obviously would be the risk language following our identification of risk and so on and so forth. The issue might be, are we able to elevate the key risk indicators to the key performance indicators such that we don't call them anymore by KRIs, because it seems to be a language problem sometimes. Once it's a KPI, somebody knows that I'm supposed to do it and I'm expected to do it. But from our side, we would be knowing that it emanates from a risk identification process. Within our risk registers, it's still called a KRI. But when it's elevated to another document, which might be a performance plan or a strategy of the organization, it's now called KPI. But it started as something that came out of a risk identification process.
Yeah,
So
no,
you
this
find
should be linked.
Yeah, you find people having a lot of documents which are not necessarily talking to each other sometimes. And that's why it will be an issue of we need to convince you that you also need to deal with KRIs whilst they've got KPIs. And I'm just giving an example. So the synergy which we're trying to bring might perhaps be another way of saying, instead of convincing you, we are just going to systematize it to be part and parcel of what the organization is all about and what the organization is doing. But competency for me is quite key, is quite critical. You find people who are not interested, you find people who are not competent, you find people who just don't care. It's your baby, you have to do it, then do it. Tell us the risks of the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like anything in business and in organizations, it's
Yeah.
the people that make the difference. Good. All right, are we... Christelle, yeah, do you want...
One comment on what I don't understand. I think as risk managers, we think that by putting our tools up in front of the guys, we're demonstrating our value. I think you must try and make your tools, your risk register, your system, your spreadsheet, your jargon, you must make that invisible to the organization for you to deliver your real value. Because the tools are confusing discussion about risk. So I think it's important that we don't make the tools run the process. We must be able to run the process.
One more, yeah?
A final comment on that
Yeah.
thing. I think the crux is learning to speak the language of the people that we're speaking to. You know, if the person is not on the same wavelength and doesn't understand what you're saying, you're never ever going to get your message across. And I think that's exactly what you were saying. You come in here, you dazzle them with all these risk numbers, and the guy, by the time you get to slide 2, you've lost your audience. If you'd actually started off with the rugby scores and an analysis of last night's match, you would actually have had everyone's attention. So you really...
Should I switch to that from the Titanic? Or the risk of the World Cup in Japan.
That's too risky.
Okay.
But the reality is you need to learn to speak the right language.
Yeah.
I mean, in 1985, Larry Sawyer, the master of internal auditing, said that they had a very difficult guy in the manufacturing area, and nobody could ever convince him of anything until he actually went in and said to him, do you know that I can prove that you're understaffed? I added up the number of hours it's going to take to do every one of the repair jobs that you have to do. Okay, and I can now prove to top management that you need to double your workforce. And
Yeah,
suddenly
that's value,
he was
yeah.
his biggest friend.
That's value,
Okay, because he had actually found the one key that was really bugging that manager, and addressed that. Then you're through. Once you have addressed that risk,
Yeah, think of their needs
okay, he'll listen to the others.
Yeah.
It's finding that key element to get in.
And it's very diverse. I mean, at that retailer, we went to IT, and IT said, "Oh yeah, we do COBIT. Here's our risk register. 350 risks go away." You know, and then when we go to HR, and they say, "We don't have any risks. Why have you come to see us?" So, you know, it's a completely different. And yeah, you're spot on. I mean, you know, you need to make that value proposition to every part of the organization. And then coming back to your point, I mean, some won't be on board. So you hope that you have a few champions. You hope that some are on the bus, and that, you know, the other ones aren't at least pushing against the bus. And then, yeah, good.
Right.
Chana.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Please feel free to join us more for coffee. But also, thank you very much, Arthur. It's been a pleasure. It's been a great presentation. A
Thanks.
pleasure having you here. And thank you for coming up.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.